Eternals is Marvel Studios' newest addition to the MCU and follows the titular Eternals, a race of immortal beings created by the Celestials, a race of cosmic gods that conduct experiments and help manage life in the universe. The film follows the Eternals on their quest to prevent the emergence, or birth, of a new Celestial, one named Tiamat. In the comics, Tiamat is better known as the Dreaming Celestial, one of the most powerful of the Celestials, and was actually trapped inside the Earth due to a conflict with other Celestials. The film certainly takes inspiration from Eternals Volume 3 and 4, though the Celestial in the film is a Celestial being born, which allowed for interesting philosophical debates and conversations between characters about whether the Earth and humanity are worth killing Tiamat and preventing other planets from being created as a result. Quite similar to the theme explored in Infinity War, when characters debated whether Vision and the Mind Stone were worth protecting if it meant the possible death of half the life in the universe. I found this theme to be one of the stronger and fitting aspects of the film. After all, cosmic films should tackle grand concepts. While I personally enjoyed the film more than I expected to, many others, critics and media sites in particular, were not fans. Eternals is not the strongest film in the MCU, however, I think this movie was better than many are giving it credit for. The film most definitely has weaknesses, though every movie does, especially those in the MCU. You know it's true even if you don't like to admit it. I get it, I'm a huge fan of the MCU as well, though I can also see the plethora of weaknesses in some of the more beloved Marvel Studio titles, such as Civil War and, yes, Endgame. Just like Eternals, those movies have flaws that don't overshadow or detract from the enjoyment of the movie as a whole. I would also like to point out that while I don't particularly enjoy using Rotten Tomatoes as a barometer of a film's quality, the website does demonstrate that fans enjoy this movie far more than critics, even the ones who typically praise or at least tolerate Marvel movies. Obviously, this may be due to fan fervor over anything Marvel related. However, I also think many are writing this film off as a shallow repeat of the Marvel formula, and I wholly disagree with that notion. To explain why I disagree with several of the criticisms of the film, I need to explain some of the criticisms and complaints about the film I've seen floating around. In terms of the structure and presentation of the film, it is supposedly boring and flat both visually and action-wise. I think a major reason for these complaints comes down to the marketing of the film, as the trailer showcases the film as being a very action-filled film, which it isn't in comparison to other MCU films. I think it's also fair to say that in general many MCU fans and critics were expecting a more action-filled movie, also because of an effect of cinematic desensitization in terms of action set pieces. Endgame in particular set the bar very high for large action scenes going forward in Marvel films, and it's just a reality that not every Marvel film will live up to those standards, or even ever intended to live up to those standards. This film has a much more slow burn and somber atmosphere, thus it would be thematically incongruent for the film to have numerous flashy battle sequences. However, I do partially agree that the action could have been better, though I think this may be an issue of too much action being forced in by the studio when the film didn't necessarily need it. In particular, I found the ambush from the Deviants at Druig's safe haven to be a bit forced, though otherwise I found the action sequences to fit the overall style of the film. I read a review that described the film as having a languid pace, which isn't a good criticism, as a movie being slow and relaxed is not a negative if that was the intended pace in the first place. I really think the marketing has negatively affected people's perceptions and expectations of the film, as it's more of a high-concept film about cosmic philosophy and rules, which is something the MCU has been leaning heavily into. Just look at Loki for an example of this. Another criticism I've seen lobbed at the movie is that the acting was also flat. Though I think that is somewhat intentional. Clearly some characters are more comedic, like Kumail Nanjiani's character Kingo, who has been very directly interacting with human culture, so it kinda makes sense. Otherwise, the characters are meant to be a bit flat and emotionless, especially toward the beginning of the film, as they have yet to come to love and care for humanity. Lest we forget, the Eternals of this film are synthetic, not exactly what humans would describe as a robot or android, though also certainly not wholly organic beings. As this is the case, it stands to reason that these characters may not feel as relatable, because in a lot of ways, they aren't. They are ancient synthetic beings powered by pure cosmic energy, and they do not reproduce. Much of the film is focused on the characters and does a solid job developing each one and providing justification for their actions as a result. Phastos settles down to live a normal life after seeing the death and destruction his creations have yielded. Druig hides himself away with a group of humans to avoid war and violence. Cersei, growing to love the humans, lives among them and lives as one of them. Makari becomes fascinated with human art and inventions and spends thousands of years stealing items to preserve and observe humanity's masterpieces. Sprite spends her time attempting to live as a grown adult yet failing, as her powers are only of illusion. When watching the film, I found myself not enjoying the first act, and much of it was for the same reason as the critique I mentioned, the flat acting. In the beginning of the film, we are largely witnessing the Eternals when they have been least touched and affected by humanity, and thus do not speak with the same intonations as humans or react as emotionally as humans, as they are separate inorganic life forms. However, as the plot progresses, the characters are humanized further and further, through conversations about humanity, philosophy, and hardships that reveal the fallibility and vulnerability of these seemingly godlike creatures. By the end of the film, the characters are much more likable and relatable than they were at the offset, which is great. That should always be the goal. Another criticism of the film is one of its antagonists, Crow. You remember Crow, right? No? No? Is the name not ringing a bell for you? Well, there may be a reason for that. You see, Crow's name is never actually said during the entire runtime of the film, though this is the name of the deviant that was evolving and becoming more humanoid as a result of absorbing the cosmic energy from the Eternals. And honestly, I can't totally defend this character. I found his inclusion throughout the majority of the film to be quite interesting and added an extra layer of mystery to the plot. However, they dropped the ball in the third act when Thena kills him. He was the type of character I would have loved to see in more MCU projects, particularly when considering he is usually more significant to the long-term story of the Eternals in the comics. I understand it's an adaptation of comic book material and not a straight copy, though it feels a bit cheap and like a disservice to fans, as Crow adds a great deal of complexity to the deviant race, and can bring about questions about whether or not it's moral to commit genocide against the species that can produce intelligent life such as Crow. In the comics, Crow is actually a love interest to Thena, and while the film somewhat hints at this history, it decides to take the advice of Kylo Ren.
Let the past die. Kill it, if you have to.
Crow is built up to be such an interesting character and villain, and he is just killed in the blink of an eye. Certainly never to return, as his body is just cut to pieces and left on the floor of an island cave. So while I really enjoyed the inclusion of Crow, ultimately they did not pull off using the character, which is a great shame. Some have also made the complaint that this film does not feel like a Marvel film, and while that may seem like a criticism for some, to me that's praise. Many critics and filmmakers despise the MCU and perceive the films as having a negative impact on the movie industry as a whole. So if this movie is more of a slow burn film that has complex and unique characters that does not end in a massive CGI battle of faceless friends and foes, why is that bad? I think the two primary reasons are the aforementioned mistake of marketing this film as an action film akin to the Avengers Endgame, which it's not. I would describe this movie as more contemplative than action-oriented, which isn't a negative. The marketing team simply chose to use only action scenes to advertise the film, which I believe has done it a disservice critically and at the box office. The other major reason is what people have come to expect from Marvel movies. In many ways, this film is the inverse of an MCU film, as it doesn't have the same structure or pace as many of the other films from the catalog, which typically follow a fairly linear path toward a clear goal. The film is not always in sixth gear firing on all cylinders, yet it doesn't have to be, as action is not everything in film, nor should it be, and I appreciate the tone and style of Eternals as it helps expand the thematic and atmospheric horizons Marvel is willing to go to break out of the stigma of simply being seen solely as superhero movies instead of movies about characters who happen to be superheroes. So no, I don't agree with much of the criticism directed at this film, yet I can understand the complaints and agree with some of them to a degree. I think the film could have benefited from being released as a Disney Plus series, though I can also understand why a story like this would want to be shown in theaters, particularly as it's setting up several major future plot lines and further builds upon the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the cosmic direction, which again is what the MCU is focusing on at the moment in Kevin Feige's grand and holy design. If you have watched this and have not seen Eternals yet, I highly recommend you do so. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with this film, and it deserves more love and attention than it's gotten. I know fans have generally reacted better to this film than critics, though it certainly has not been received as well as Marvel likely would have hoped. This film cost $200 million to make, which is fairly par for the course for Marvel films. However, the film has not been doing great at the box office. Even at the time of writing this video, a week after the film was released, mind you, the film has still only reached around $170 million globally, which is a bleak result. I really want Marvel to make more films like this, and not only films that center around giant CGI fight scenes. If this film doesn't start to make more money, it will send a message to Disney and Marvel that films like Eternals just don't make enough money for them, and that's a depressing thought, as this movie is an example of films largely deviating from the accepted Marvel formula. Now stop listening to me, Gab, and go watch the dang movie, you silly scallywags. Oh, also, one minor criticism I've heard is that it doesn't make sense that Cersei could have transformed Sprite into a human being at the end of the film, but did y'all forget how she transmuted a deviant into a tree earlier in the film, and not 5 minutes before offering to turn Sprite into a human, Cersei transmuted a giant golden space god emerging from the earth into marble? Is it really that far-fetched for Cersei to be able to transmute a synthetic being into an organic one? Okay, you do you.